Well, good evening. Thank you all for coming. I'm Neil Chase. For those of you I haven't met, I'm the CEO at CalMatters. We're going to spend some time here sharing some wisdom from my team with you. I want to first just thank you all for showing up and for being interested in this stuff. We exist because there's so many important topics that aren't covered very well, aren't talked about much, and we are here to help. So we're happy that you're here. We're also very happy to be at the Battery, a place we've been often, and a lot of our members are members here, and Battery Powered has been incredibly generous to us and supportive of our work. So we're very thankful for that, and for all of you who support us through that, thank you. I want to introduce our crew. Dave Lesher is the editor of CalMatters and co-founder. It's been 7 years since they started CalMatters, and started with a handful of people, 5-6 people, and we're now over 50. And we're over that magical 5-year mark that most startups don't get to, and doing surprisingly well. I'm surprised. Dave's not surprised. He knew it would work. Dave's a longtime journalist. Worked in Connecticut, worked at the LA Times for many years, including a lot of time covering Sacramento, covering governors and the legislature. Worked at New America and PPIC, and then was talked into launching CalMatters. And it's been an amazing ride. And Ben Christopher. Ben is a native of the city of San Francisco, born and raised here. Has been with us for, I don't know, 5-6 years, something like that. 5 years. And is our lead political writer at a time when California politics couldn't be more interesting and more important. He's also the parent of a newborn. So he gets to, a child who was nice enough to wait until after the recall election to be born by several weeks.
Just about 1 week.
1 week, okay. And so Ben hasn't slept lately, but he's still energized and fired up to be here. And they're going to share a little bit with you about what we call the state of the state, what's going on in California, what's happening in Sacramento, the stuff that is so important and affects all of us every day that most of us don't pay nearly enough attention to. And then we'll talk a little bit about this election that we have going on, an only in California kind of election. And we'll take your questions as well. So I'm going to give Dave and Ben a little time to start us off, and then we'll do some Q&A after that. Joe.
Well, great. Well, hey, it's great to be here. It's nice to be in person with friends and to talk about. Oops, that's right. I forgot. I knew there was something in my hand for some reason.
We have people. There are folks with us on the live stream as well, so we'll make sure to use the mics.
Yeah, So anyway. It's great to be in person. It's great to talk about politics and CalMatters, two of my favorite topics. So Ben and I are going to talk about the state budget. Which sounds really wonky, but we'll try and make it really fun. We're going to talk about it because just like a week ago, the governor announced that the state has $100 billion surplus, which is just staggering. I mean, it's just a lot of money. And then we're also going to talk about the election year, as Neil mentioned. So I'm going to get started, and we're going to try and have a little bit of banter here back and forth about, comparing notes about what we're both seeing, and then we'll take questions, but happy to keep this casual too. So if there's anything that you don't understand, feel free to shout out or something. So let me get started, and I want to put something in perspective here because, like I say, the amount of money is just staggering to me. I mean, I think those of us who have covered California for a long time, I think I go back 25 years of working around the state government in media and in the think tank world. We're used to very big numbers, but the numbers that we're dealing with right now are just a whole order of magnitude bigger than anything we've ever seen. Not only is there $100 billion surplus this year, which, on a $300 billion budget, but last year there was a $76 billion surplus, so $176 billion over 2 years. On top of that, there was last year there was another $26 billion in federal money that went to the state government that was not anticipated. So there was actually $100 billion last year in unexpected revenue. And if you may remember, the governor put together what he called the California Comeback Plan, where he spending the $100 billion surplus last year in a way that he said would be a transformational investment that would pay dividends for generations to come. So, and we'll see. There was a lot of it still going out. It's definitely making a difference. The poverty rate in California, PPIC just reported, has dropped from 16% to 12%. The first time it's been at 12% since they've been tracking it. That's the rate with cost of living accounted for. But I think one of the big questions is whether it stays there or whether that's just an effect of the stimulus that'll wear off. But that's something we'll be watching. I think the other, another number we saw last year, well, in the governor's budget proposal this year, the Department of Finance said that there was $657 billion in federal stimulus money that came to California over the last year and a half. So 657 billion. That a lot of that's the PPP money. That's everything. That's the unemployment insurance or checks. That's all the stimulus money. But it's an enormous amount of money that came into California. And then on top of that, besides the stimulus and besides the surplus we've just seen, the state general fund has been growing rapidly, really rapidly. It went up from roughly $200 billion to $300 billion this year in just the 5 years, just the past 5 years. And then it has doubled it's doubled in the last 10 years. So a $300 billion general fund budget is pretty amazing. So you're going to see a lot of things that we might have bonded out for that are going to be paid by cash. If you've been here a while, you've seen there's usually a water bond or an education bond or something like that on the ballot. And those costs are being paid for with cash now. I think the governor, Ben will get into this a bit, but a lot of where he put the money was one-time expenses. And I think that's one of the things we'll be watching. How much of this surplus money is put into one-time costs or debt or reserves or things like that versus, things that might be ongoing expenses that we'd have to continue to get this money to pay for. Some of the biggest problems the state, this is a state that obviously has some very big problems. Housing and homelessness is probably at the top of the list, but it's a state that has drought and wildfires and big climate ambitions, achievement gap in public schools, and all of those things have gotten significantly billions and billions more than they had before. The climate budget was a couple $100 million a year, and now, I think it's over 6 years or 7 years, there's $35 billion in the budget. So, and same for housing and homelessness. There's a total of over $14 billion over the last 2 years that's been put into homelessness. So it's a lot, and we will be watching to see how this money is spent and how transformational it is. I think there's a lot of reason to hope that this is going to make a big difference. But there's also a lot of questions that we'll be watching. Will this be a transformational investment that will pay dividends for generations to come, or as I mentioned, are we seeing the effects of a stimulus that will wear off? I think this is a state that has the highest poverty rate in America and one of the highest rates of inequality, and it's at the top of the list of priorities for this legislature and this governor. How do we close that inequality gap, and how do we respond to the poverty rate? And I think one of the big questions is how can government pay its way out of those problems? I mean, obviously money helps, but how much of those problems can be helped with government spending? I think obviously how the governor is deciding to spend this money. And I think one of the things that we'll be watching very closely is what kind of monitoring there is for how the money is spent to see if it is working. I mean, it's one of the things that government doesn't always do very well in California. And I got, when the governor Newsom just the week before last announced his May revise of the state budget, which is, he puts out a budget proposal in January. And then in May, he puts out a revision of that budget based on the latest economic forecast. So he has the better sense of what the revenue is. And then now the budget is in the legislature, where they have until June 15th to adopt the budget for the fiscal year that begins July 1. But when the governor announced the May revise about a week and a half ago, he talked about the accountability for the money, especially on the homeless issue. There was the state auditor put out a report earlier this year raising questions about how the title of the report was "The State's Uncoordinated Response to the Homeless Issue." And so as the state, as we put out about $14 billion, a lot of it, which is really going to go to local level decision making. There's a lot of discretion at the local level about how they spend that money, because obviously the problems are different everywhere. But the governor, when he made that announcement, talked about the need for accountability in tracking how that money is spent. And so, I think we, CalMatters, we're building an accountability desk this year, where it's going to have a couple of investigative reporters and a data dashboard about how decisions are made and who makes them, and tracking votes and lobbyists and money and legislators. And I think this will be one of the things that we watch, is what the decisions are made and how much difference they make. So that, I just wanted to give the big picture, the context for, what's happening right now, the decisions being made in just the next couple of weeks about how to spend a $300 billion budget with a $100 billion surplus. And, a lot of this is just one step in a rapidly increasing budget for California. So Ben is going to talk a little bit about, exactly how the governor proposed to spend that $100 billion surplus and some of the rest of the budget. And then we'll chat about that a bit, and then we'll talk about elections.
Sure. Thanks, Dave. And thanks to all of you for coming. And I know we probably, you're getting tired of hearing that $100 billion is a lot of money. Obviously, it's a lot of money. But I think in California, fifth largest economy in the world, if it was its own country, 1, 10, or 11-digit number can get lost from the other. And obviously, it is a huge number. Another way of thinking about it is the $100 billion is larger than the entire state budget of, I think, all but 2 states. And that's how much extra the state has. And so you might be wondering, well, where did all that money come from? Like, why is the state sitting on that much money? And it kind of reminds me of, I guess, 2 years ago, lost track of time completely, but I think 2 years ago, at the beginning of the pandemic, around April or May, I was tasked with writing a story projecting how the state was preparing to deal with this once in a lifetime recession. People were actually using the D word, depression, right? And so obviously most people agreed that was going to be horrible for the state budget, because of course, when the economy falls off a cliff, the state is going to suffer. And then fast forward a few months, in January, the governor comes out with his January proposal, and all of a sudden we're sitting on this massive surplus, which has only grown since then. Now we have this new year where we're sitting on an extra $100 billion. And so I guess there are 2 factors there. One is the state's inequality, and also paired with that, the state's very progressive income tax system, where most of I think about half of the state's money comes from the top 1% of earners, or something. I might have that stat wrong, but there's a giant disparity there. And so even during the worst of the recession, now of course that the economy is doing quite a bit better, and maybe even overheating, as the stock market has done very well, and as high earners have done very well in the state has done very well as well. And so that's where all that money is coming from. And so now the question is, what are we going to do with all that extra money? And so that becomes a big subject of negotiation. Dave mentioned that the governor just came out with his May revision, which is basically just a blueprint. It's a proposal about how he would like to spend that money. And now the state legislature has a month to figure out how to spend the $300 billion, slightly oversimplifying because a lot of that is bound to certain things. So for example, when you're looking at this, this surplus, by law, by the state constitution, about 45% of that is reserved for education, public K through 12. So that leaves only, $49 billion. So only 49 billion. And then some of that has to be set aside for reserve. So again, we're still dealing with a lot of money. And so the governor came out fairly early on, tried to emphasize very strongly that somewhere between 95 and 99% of the surplus is going to be spent on one-time expenses. And again, the idea being that this is a surplus that the state is riding high really right now because the economy is doing well, but the trend in California politics, again, or in the California budget, because it's so dependent on the booms and busts of the stock market and the highest earners, it's very volatile. And so you could see next year, if the economy slows, that surplus disappears, and then all of a sudden we're dealing with a deficit. And so that's why he's saying, as tempting as it might be, and this is maybe a political conversation as well, the governor is trying to get ahead of the legislature, saying, yes, $100 billion is a big number, but let's not sort of throw that at some ongoing expense. And also, I think there's a political dimension to that as well, where his predecessor, Jerry Brown, really had this reputation as sort of being the adult in the room. That was sort of the cliche that the legislature, dominated by Democrats, really wanted to spend beyond the state's means. Potentially, this is of course Jerry Brown's version. I'm sure the legislature has its own version. And Jerry Brown was the one saying, no, we need to put more in reserves. We need to cut back. We need to, he's pumping the brake as much as possible. And so I think to a certain extent, I don't know if you agree with that, Dave, but Gavin Newsom is trying to sort of, assure voters, assure the legislature, assure himself maybe that he's just as responsible and thoughtful as Jerry Brown as well. Even though he's very young and handsome and so forth. But and so we're looking at one-time expenses. This is based on the governor's May revision, which again is just a proposal. Obviously, the governor has a lot of agenda setting power by sort of laying out the first blueprint, but the legislature can take it or leave it. And so I think a lot of that is going into large investments. He put a big priority on sort of climate related investments, which is a pretty big umbrella. So it includes grid modernization. It also falls into wildfire fighting and prevention and forest clearing and so forth, drought and water, desal, this kind of thing. And then you also have a big chunk of it, and maybe the most, if not the most politically contentious, then at least the amount that's getting the most news recently is sort of the big chunk of the one-time expenditure that is going to be directed at financial relief to individuals, sort of under the umbrella of addressing higher costs and inflation, and specifically the price of gas, because that's kind of sort of dominated headlines and given a lot of lawmakers headaches politically. And so the governor has come out with this proposal that he essentially wants to send every car owner in the state, with some exceptions that I'll get to, every car owner in the state $400 for gas, or they can spend it on whatever they want. It's cash. The legislature has already kind of shot that down. There will be ongoing negotiations because they say, well, A, why are we sending money to people who drive when we have all these very ambitious climate goals in mind? And also, what about people who don't drive? The governor's kind of responded to that by throwing additional money at transit agencies, saying, well, hopefully, with incentives to make transit free. And he's also capped it, the amount of money to, I believe it's 2 cars per family. So you only get, and also they put a cap yet to be defined on the value of the car. So if you have like a brand new, I don't know, what's a really fancy car, Maserati, then you're not going to get it, I guess. These details are yet to be worked out. But the legislature has basically said that, no, that's a stupid idea. We just want to send cash to everyone. So we want to send cash, or everyone who makes under $250,000 a year. So there's going to be a debate over that. And of course, the Republicans in the legislature, who do exist, there are Republicans in the legislature, about a quarter of the legislature, which is not enough to actually matter in most cases, but they do exist. And they have said, rather than sending people money, why don't we just cut the tax or eliminate the tax temporarily, perhaps? And so those are sort of the terms of the debate that we're seeing play out in the next month among many other issues.
Yeah, it's this is just the next couple of weeks. It's very different than Sacramento used to be. I think it used to be, frankly, that the Democrats in the Assembly and the Senate and the governor's office were pretty much in sync. I mean, there were some disagreements, but these days, I mean, there's a Senate plan, there's an Assembly plan, and there's a governor's plan. And then the Senate and Assembly are working together more than they're working with the governor. So it's a much different dynamic than it ever has been before. And I also, as Ben kind of mentioned, I think Jerry Brown was about the most powerful governor I've ever seen just in my time covering Sacramento. I mean, just the authority that he had to influence the legislative discussion. And when he said something and put his foot down, it usually happened. And Newsom hasn't come in with that same kind of authority over the legislature. They feel very comfortable taking him on. And, their first reaction to his budget proposal was, basically this isn't going to happen, like you said.
Yeah, basically the Assembly Speaker's response was, well, I look forward to negotiating with the Senate over the details of this budget. And the Senate's pro tem's response was basically, well, I look forward to negotiating with the Assembly. Not like, no mention of the governor specifically. So. And yeah, I mean, it's a good question, sort of why it is that Jerry Brown perhaps commanded more authority than Newsom. I think there are a couple of reasons. One is Jerry Brown had been around a while. This was not his first rodeo, even as governor, obviously, and so he just kind of commanded that authority. But also, I think there's also an interesting timing issue, which is that in 2012 you saw sort of a new round of sort of a new class of a lot of legislators entering the Capitol just because of the timing of redistricting and the timing of new term limits. And so by the time Gavin Newsom shows up, Speaker Rendon, Pro Tem Atkins, they've sort of been around longer in the legislature than Newsom. And so I think there's sort of this idea that, like, well, who are you to to tell us how to do our jobs, kind of thing. So I think that's sort of an interesting dynamic playing out as well.
Yeah. And it's an election year, and everybody's on the ballot, and so there's a lot at play in these discussions. But I would expect they're going to get something on by the deadline. It's another thing that's changed. If you remember, it wasn't too many years ago. The budget would stretch into August and September. The state was issuing IOUs. We had to. It was because they couldn't agree on a budget, and that was back when there was a 2/3 majority required to pass the budget. And since then, what was it, 2012, we passed a majority vote budget. So now, Democrats basically represent 3/4 of the legislature. So it's really completely an issue among Democrats. But, to show a little bit about how far apart they are, Senator Toni Atkins, the leader of the Senate, housing is her big issue, and she has a proposal to put $10 billion for first-time home buyers to make it easier for them to buy homes. So $10 billion is a pretty big chunk, and in fact, the whole Senate, the Senate leadership, I should say, put out a proposal for the budget ahead of the governor's budget. Which I have never seen them do before. So there's a lot of jockeying going on. And, the other thing that's very different is that in the past, a lot of these discussions were in public. They were in budget subcommittee hearings, and they were, and now I think most of this jockeying will be behind closed doors unless, there's some big riff that they decide to go public with. But anyway, a lot happening in the next couple of weeks.
Although what's kind of interesting, and we were talking about this backstage, but like the or whatever that room is, the budget is obviously sort of like the big the big contentious issue this year or in the next couple of months. But in terms of sort of sweeping legislative packages, this is actually kind of a quiet year, and I wonder if you have thoughts about that. Maybe my thinking on that is just partly it's an election year, and so particularly on issues like housing, where last year and the year before there were some really substantive changes to housing law, the way that housing law is done in California. I don't think anyone really wants to touch that this year because it's you're likely to sort of inflame the passions. And then there's also just the issue of, again, I mentioned in 2012 there was sort of this new class of legislators who really came in. A lot of them are leaving, and so you have by last count, I think there were 26 members, both the Senate and the Assembly. There are 40 members overall in the Senate, 80 in the Assembly. So 26 is a pretty big chunk who are either have either left early through their session or have decided that they're not going to run again or are termed out. So that's a huge exodus of people who, many of whom are running for Congress, or they're running for a statewide office, or they're running for sheriff or whatever it is. And so, just human nature being what it is, I wonder if perhaps people just aren't as focused on what's
and one of the other big changes in the makeup of the legislature too, there's 12-year term limits now, and there used to be 14 years, but you had to serve 6 in the Assembly and you could spend 8 in the Senate. Now you can spend all 12 in one chamber. So actually, Rendon, the Assembly Speaker now, has been the longest speaker since, I think, Willie Brown. The turnover and the leadership was all so quick. So that's changed the dynamic a bit too. I think once the leaders have been in power as long as they have, Atkins and Rendon both, they feel a bit more authority. And that's probably had something to do with their relationship with Newsom too. But one thing I think Ben's absolutely right. I mean, I think this legislative agenda this year, usually there's about, 3 or 4 or 5 really big initiatives that are trying to get through. And this year is pretty lean. There's one that we were talking about too. It's actually big, but it hasn't gotten a lot of attention in the governor's proposal in January, budget proposal. There was the state plans to extend medical coverage to all the undocumented in the state.
Medicaid,
yeah. We already approved coverage for children. Last year, there was coverage extended to undocumented seniors, and this year the proposal is to cover all undocumented in California, which really it really hasn't gotten that much attention. But I expect it'll pass, especially with the budget as big as it is. But that's a big step. I mean, Newsom ran on a single payer health plan, as I think everybody knows, and there's still a lot of pressure for him to do that. He appointed a task force to look into the issue, but has kind of pushed it.
Yeah, he hasn't been talking about that as much lately. It's
no.
kind of funny. Yeah.
So he instead of a single payer, he now his term is universal coverage, which with the extension to the undocumented population in California, which was the biggest uncovered population. It's moving closer to universal coverage.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I kind of wonder why it hasn't gotten as much attention, maybe just because, as we were talking about, 3/4 of the legislature are Democrats. It's hard to imagine that that's going to be a contentious issue in the legislature. But of course it is. It will sort of fill the gap of one of the largest populations of folks who are not covered, as Dave said. I guess another series of bills that are kind of interesting this year is just sort of under the umbrella of California defining itself as the anti-Texas, which you see in the budget, the governor putting forward, I forget the number off the top of my head, but quite a bit more money into reproductive health and abortion, sort of a response, of course, to the Supreme Court's draft opinion, but also SB 8, this law out of Texas that made it effectively bans abortion after 6 weeks, maybe 6 weeks. And then, of course, you're seeing sort of similar legislation in Oklahoma and across the country. And so California trying to sort of position itself as a sort of a beacon or a refuge for folks seeking abortions, but providing a lot more resources in that. And then also you see a number of gun bills that in some ways sort of are a response to the same thing, where you have legislation making it much easier to sue gun manufacturers and gun distributors, holding them legally liable for violence committed by guns, and then also a bill that is basically modeled on SB 8 in Texas. Essentially provides a private right of action. In Texas, the law is it provides a private right of action. Anyone can sue someone for aiding and abetting the getting an abortion. Well, this would provide a private right of action to any Californian who wants to sue someone for either acquiring a designated assault rifle or assault weapon, or acquiring a ghost gun, I believe it is. And so that's an interesting one, because of course the governor was very critical of SB 8, not just on its own term, not just in terms of the substance and the policy, but also just as sort of a legal maneuver, and sort of saying that it's it doesn't end run around a constitutionally protected right. And so, but also now taking that same approach and sort of applying it to guns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's even a couple $1 million in the budget proposal to as an incentive for businesses in anti-abortion states to move to California. So
anti-abortion states or anti-LGBTQ or trans, again, really targeting at states like Florida, sort of with the so-called don't say gay legislation, or Texas, where there has been recent policy sort of directed at the families of transgender kids.
Yeah. So we could transition right into the election there then.
Well, there you go. Yeah. Nicely done.
I'll start out. There's no initiatives on the primary ballot in June, which, a while ago we moved all the initiatives to the November ballot, but the legislature can still put things on the May ballot. But they chose not to this year. So everything's on the November ballot, and there's still a couple weeks more for things that still have time to qualify. But looking at what's in the pipeline, we can see some of the things that are coming. One of the things that has qualified is you'll be asked whether you want to ban flavored tobacco in California. That's going to be a referendum on a bill that passed. There is sports gambling is going to be perhaps the biggest fight on the ballot this year, just because there's so much money behind it. There were actually 4 initiatives that were filed, 4 competing initiatives, and now it looks like we're down to 2. And whether they compete or not, or one of them drops out, we'll have to see. But there was the first was from the Indian tribes that put an initiative into where you could bet on sports in person in a casino, in a tribal casino in California. The next one was put on by card rooms around the state, that they would take sports betting. And then the third one was put on by FanDuel and DraftKings.
That's the big one.
Corporate national online sports gambling corporations. There's 30 states that have some form of sports gambling now, following a 2018 Supreme Court decision. So that's the big one. And then there's one more that was filed, but it didn't get enough signatures, and that would have been allowed tribal casinos to operate online sports betting as well. So right now, it's the 2 that are headed to the ballot are the tribal measure that is for in casino gambling, or the FanDuel DraftKings measure that's for online gambling. And the question is whether the tribal measure drops off, so that they basically go out to try and kill the FanDuel and DraftKings measure. There were 2 tribal measures up there, and they dropped the second one. They dropped the tribal measure for online gambling because they decided that instead they'll try and kill the DraftKings FanDuel measure. So it's going to be a mess. It's going to be. I would imagine it's going to set. I think our record spending for an initiative is about $220 billion.
Yeah, that was the Lyft and Uber one. Prop 22.
Prop 22. but I would imagine this is going to break that record. Let's see, the kidney dialysis measure you might have seen before, that'll be back.
We're voting on that again.
There's two measures. Not all of these have qualified yet, but they're in the final stages. There's two measures to raise income taxes on wealthy. One is for incomes over 5 million to pay for pandemic response, pandemic preparation, and one is for incomes over 2 million to pay for climate effects, wildfire and electric cars mostly. There's an increase in the minimum wage. Any others you can think of?
No, those are kind of the biggies, and I do think it's sort of worth sort of noting. You mentioned Prop 22 from last time around, 2020, which was the Uber and Lyft and DoorDash and et cetera funded measure, which broke all records, and how we could see that record break again. And I do think it's just kind of an interesting, when you're mentioning sort of the biggest ones where you have FanDuel and DraftKings and the flavored tobacco referendum, which is actually a response to the state legislature passed a sort of an effective ban on flavored tobacco, and then a referendum was put on the ballot to try and strike it down, of course, funded by tobacco companies. And so you do see this sort of trend of the ballot, which these ballot measures were, of course, introduced as sort of in a reform era in California as a way of sort of a check on the trusts. At the time it was Rail, which kind of ran the state, and of course now that the state is 3/4 out of in the legislature are Democrat, and many of whom are very progressive, that the ballot becomes sort of an escape valve or an end run around the legislature, a way to sort of channel those interests who don't really have much of a say in the legislature.
There's one other that I forgot. It would spend 1% of the state general fund on arts and music in public schools. That is sponsored by Austin Butner, the former school superintendent in Los Angeles.
But this time around in June, I mean, presumably many of you have already gotten your ballots, but that's sort of the election that I'm focusing on now as the election reporter. And of course, it's sort of we're talking about this. I think that the sort of the most interesting and sort of competitive statewide races are attorney general and controller, which is a little bit sad for a political reporter to say. Like everyone should get really excited about the controller's race. And everyone's like, what do they control? Like very few people actually know what this race does. But it is actually, I'm not trying to put you to sleep. It is actually a very interesting race. The controller is kind of I mean, among other things, Dave mentioned sort of the auditing function of the state of California, and that's the controller oversees the auditor, and also is sort of the bookkeeper of the state. And so there's sort of an argument to be made that it's actually a very important role, because it's someone who sort of oversees the state that, for better or for worse, is basically under one party rule. And so you have one Republican, Lon Hee Chen, who's running. And because, if you don't remember, in California, we have this top two primary system where regardless of party, the top two winners in the primary will move on to the general election. Because you only basically have one Republican with any kind of name recognition and money behind him running, he's almost assuredly going to be one of those top two. And so then you have 4 Democrats who are running, and it's very competitive, trying to figure out who's there. And so all of a sudden, I spent a lot of time looking at campaign finance, and you see like millions of dollars of outside money pouring into the controller's race. It's like the most, way more than the governor's race. And it's like, why? But of course it's because it's an open seat, and because you have sort of this opportunity to either pick someone who's quite progressive or someone who's a little bit more business friendly. And that kind of is part of this theme that you see throughout California, where particularly business interests who have recognized that if they want to have a seat at the table in California, it helps in statewide, where Republicans haven't won since 2006, or in a lot of very blue districts, it helps to pick your preferred Democrat rather than put all your eggs a Republican. That metaphor made no sense, but you get my meaning.
Yeah, it's an exciting race. We've actually had most of these candidates in to talk to us in-person interviews, and they've made it sound like this office has a lot more power than I ever thought. And it actually, there is that auditing function that a lot of controllers have, but they just don't use it. But both Steve Glazer, who's the state senator from the East Bay, or former Orinda mayor, he's running, and Lonnie Chen especially are promoting that ability to use the audit function to keep Sacramento more honest. That's their campaign platforms. So it's going to be it'll be an interesting race, and like I say, the top two. I don't know. I guess my big question is whether whether Lonnie Chen can get to the top two and have a Republican in the November race, because that's probably the only statewide race they'll even have a Republican in the general election.
Yeah, we'll see. The other one that I mentioned was Attorney General, which of course Rob Bonta is our Attorney General, and so there's a big question. He's certainly going to make top two, but
Yeah.
the other question is who is it going to be? Is
Right.
it going to be
Yeah,
Nathan
that's true.
Hochman, who's a Republican, or is it going to
Yeah.
be Anne Marie Schubert, who's the prosecutor in Sacramento, who is running? She was a Republican until 2 years ago, and then she decided that she wasn't a Republican. Now she's a no party preference, which means she doesn't have a party. But she sounds a lot like a Republican, so it's sort of an interesting question, at least academically, of whether having that R next to your name on the ballot helps more than having a NPP next to your name, which no one knows what NPP is in California. And then, of course, to make things even more interesting, if you find these things interesting, is there's another guy running named Eric Early. He's a very, very conservative Republican who ran for Attorney General in 2018 and didn't go anywhere with that. And he also helped sort of manage the recall campaign against Newsom last year. And he's very conservative, touts his, he's very opposed to abortion. He's very pro Second Amendment. He loves President Trump. And so now all of a sudden you see advertisements from the Bonta campaign saying things like, Rob Bonta will stand for abortion rights, unlike super conservative Eric Early. Eric Early believes this and this and this, and and all of a sudden you're like, why is Rob Bonta talking so much about Eric Early, who has no money compared to Schubert or Hochman? And of course, it's because he wants Republicans to hear that ad and think, oh, Eric Early thinks all those things. Oh, I'm going to vote for him. So it's an odd maneuver that you often see in California politics of people spending in such a way to try to effectively pick their preferred opponent.
Right. Try and tell Republicans who he wants to run against. Or yeah, I forgot Nathan Hochman is one who has a good shot at being on the November ballot. He's a U.S. attorney from Los Angeles and a Republican, but never held office before. So we should get the questions here. Happy to open it up to talk about anything.
Let us know if you have a question. We can bring a mic over to you. If you don't,
I'll try mine. I'll just project.
Here you go.
Okay. Thank you. Is there anything in the new for the 100 billion or the other 300 billion for high-speed rail? Curious.
There is. It is. I mean, right now the high-speed rail is being funded out of the cap and trade program for climate change, and I haven't heard that that's going to go up.
No, it's basically
It's still.
The governor didn't really change that. He just keep throwing.
I think the big question about high-speed rail is the federal infrastructure bill, and whether California gets a big chunk of that. There's still a lot of the high-speed rail still hasn't been paid for, but I don't think the state budget went up beyond what it already is.
But it is a sort of a tricky political issue right now, where another disagreement to the governor and a lot of the legislature, where you have the governor, as some of you might recall, he made a sort of an announcement. I don't know if it was intentional or not, but during his State of the State speech, I think it was last year, he basically said, well, we had this high-speed rail project and it was supposed to go from San Francisco to LA. Right now, we're just going to focus on the Central Valley component from Bakersfield to Fresno. Merced, thank you. So Merced. So if you were in Bakersfield, you can go to Merced, or if you're in Merced, you can go to Bakersfield. But so that was the response from a lot of people. And so now you have some people in the legislature, including, I believe, the Assembly Speaker, who's a little bit, he's basically arguing like maybe we should just take these funds and invest in interrail, intercity rail or other kinds of projects and or just whatever they want. And so the governor's pushing back on that. But I think to answer your question, the budget has not really changed the math.
Yeah, it does seem like Speaker Rendon is not in favor of the high-speed rail and more in favor of transit. So another one of the bumps there.
Is there? Very officious here. I'm really curious about the cash, the money that they'd like to do one-time payouts on. Is there an idea about how much is going to go toward bond indebtedness that we've incurred over generations? It seems like. Do you have a sense of what kind of relief we might be getting in this cash surplus that's showing up?
So there's $3.5 billion to pay down the pension debt. It's frankly, the pension debt, because the economy has been doing so well and because the state has had a surplus, we still have an unfunded liability in our pension. It was more of a crisis a couple of years ago. It was it looked pretty serious, but like I say, the economy and the growing budget has kind of moved that down the priority list. But so it's $3.5 billion. It's a small part of what the unfunded liability is. I think it's tens of billions still for the unfunded liability. There's some money. There's a business tax that pays for all the unemployment checks that go out, and we ran up several, I think around $20 billion in debt that would have to be paid off by California businesses if we don't cover that debt. And I think there's some federal money coming into that, but also some of the state money. There's also, the state has a reserve, a rainy day fund that is being pushed up to about $28 billion, I believe. So that's for the next downturn. But, California's budget is so volatile that, I think the latest estimate is that a typical recession over 2 years would be more like $70 or $80 billion of lost revenue. So we're at about $28 billion in reserve, which will help, but there's still more to go. And then I don't think we've paid down bonds that I'm aware of, but yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, is it working? You mentioned a couple options around the surplus around transportation. One, I think you maybe said eliminating the gas tax, the state tax on gas, and then another might be making public transportation free. How much traction do you think we would get around either of those options?
Yeah, so just to clarify, so the governor's proposal includes both sending checks to folks with cars, $400 per car up to a certain point, and then on top of that, he also included, I think it's $750 million in incentive grants to transit agencies, saying, if you make transit free for the next 3 months, you can have some of this money. I believe that, I'm not sure exactly beyond that how the details of that are worked out in terms of. So when you ask like traction, are you asking like politically or?
Yeah, and they're both great options.
Yeah. So that would be the governor's plan. That didn't get a very warm reception by the legislative leadership. They actually much more prefer just sending more cash directly to Californians, making under a certain amount of money, regardless of whether they own a car or not. So it's unclear to me sort of between those two options where they're going to come down. I mentioned that the Republicans would like to just see the gas tax put on a holiday. I don't think that's going anywhere.
Yeah, it's amazing how how hard it is to figure out how to give people money. Like as they've got, I mean, I think the governor's plan is, what is it, 11 billion or one of them's 18 billion, one of them's 11 billion. Anyway, one of the proposals. Anyway, it's very hard to figure out how to get money to people. What are the cutoffs? How you can't have too much paperwork that you got to qualify for it. How do you get it out there the easiest you can and the fastest you can? And I think that's where the governor came to his idea, is just send it to registered car owners. And we can do that
Through the
really
DMV.
fast, through the DMV. It was 2 cars maximum, $400 a car. And as soon as you start putting, I mean, the legislature wants to means test it. So so it goes mostly to people who need it the most. But as soon as you do that, then it adds a layer of how do you test for that? And it slows down the process. So anyway, there's a lot of opinions there's a lot more work that has to be done on exactly how they're going to do that. But it's not easy. It's amazing how hard it is to figure out how to get money to people.
Yeah, and that's what you'll hear from the Republicans as well, saying, look, if we just suspend the tax, there's no administrative hurdle to that. We don't need to figure out who gets which tax. We just suspend it, and then it will go into effect immediately, rather than something that might not pass until June or July. It might not even go out the door until after that. And so there's sort of an intellectual debate around that. I'm not an economist, but sort of whether, by cutting the tax or reducing the tax, whether that the incidence of the tax would flow to consumers, or whether they would just the prices would just come up and sort of eat that away. So anyway.
Hi. You mentioned that there aren't a lot of initiatives this time around. So is it, how difficult is it to get an initiative on the ballot? And does it cost a lot of money? And is there a particular procedure you have to follow? Or?
Yes, it costs a lot of money, which is often why the initiatives that really qualify are either funded by large corporations or large unions, or just extremely rich people who just want to. So it's based on, you have to gather a certain number of signatures, and it's based on a certain percentage of the prior election, the turnout in the prior election. I believe it's 8% of the prior gubernatorial.
Yeah, it's the governor's
Yeah.
race.
And so depending on how high turnout was the last election, then it can be, I think this time around it's around 900,000. It also depends on what kind of signature you're getting. Anyway, the point being is that if you've walked into a grocery store recently and someone has accosted you with a clipboard saying, like, please sign this to do, that's what they're doing. And they have to get, about 1 million of those. And in fact, because those signatures all get audited and a certain number of them are invalidated because the person moved, or because if it's a duplicate or whatever, often you hear from signature gatherers that you need to have something like 1.2 million to be qualified. And so perhaps, and I'd be curious to look into this, but maybe one of the reasons we're not seeing as many this year is because with the pandemic, it's just been harder to gather signatures, both because of the pandemic and also because the public health issue, but also because the labor shortage. You have to pay other people a lot more, and so it's a bit more expensive.
Yeah, the price. There's an industry that runs initiatives. You hire a signature gathering firm, and you hire in addition to your campaign consultant, and the cost per signature varies a lot. But part of it is how much time you have to get the signatures. A lot of initiatives are filed late, so they have to move fast, so it's more expensive.
I think I remember hearing that at one point FanDuel and DraftKings were paying something like $12 or $15 a signature, which is just like
that's
miles higher than anything else. So
that's
perhaps the reason.
I think I've heard $2 to $5 for initiatives in the past, but 10 to 12 would be way high.
So if you have a signature gatherer, confront you, they'll probably lead with that one. So like, sign this one. Oh, and also you can sign these ones if you want. I want that $15 first.
You mentioned inequality is, one of the worst states. And then you talked about how hard it is to give away money. And I was thinking about some innovation that we have in our state, like in Stockton, Michael Tubbs trying all kinds of, universal basic income. Is there ever any, pot of money that's, for beta testing, initiatives like what's going on in Stockton and maybe expanding to other communities? I just was curious about.
Yeah. We actually will be writing about this. We've written a little bit, but so the state actually already passed a $35 million universal basic income pilot project, and it's based on the Stockton experience. Stockton Mayor Michael Tubbs had this project for, I think it was $1,000 a month for a couple hundred families, and the state put in $35 million in last year's budget to fund 5 different programs around the state, and they're all just getting going right now. But they're all very different. They're all targeted to different populations. They have different amounts, but it's going to be one of the bigger experiments in the country on universal basic income. So yeah, we're going to be following that very closely.
I like the idea of us being innovative and that other states copy what works here and other communities within California copy good, successful programs. So that's going to be an important report. Thank you for following that.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting issue. A lot of questions about it. And, like I say, I think California is going to learn a lot from this. Yeah.
I'm curious if you have any comments on the supply chain disruption and how it's impacting California exporters, particularly the agriculture community.
Yeah, I haven't heard that. I mean, it's obviously having a huge impact. It hasn't impacted the state budget, obviously.
Well, except indirectly in the sense that inflation is affecting the state budget, and there's a lot of political response to that. But yeah, in terms of searching for something smart to say about this.
I'm just wondering, about port infrastructure, highways, anything.
Dave, this could be where you explain the need for an agriculture beat that we don't have yet.
Right. Well, there was the governor did we went to 24-hour operation of the ports. Remember that was last year at the beginning of the supply chain problem. They ordered the ports to go 24 hours a day. But I haven't heard the supply chain problem having an impact on the state revenue or state operation.
I know there's also part of the climate investment that what he's designated to be the one-time climate investment, that it does include set aside some funds to help farmers deal with the drought, which is not addressing supply chain issues, but I guess it does speak to the fact that this is a tough year or two or four for California farmers.
Yeah.
On my way.
Thank you for all the questions.
On my way.
Hi, thank you for your time. I know this is more of a facts-based discussion, but I'm curious about your opinion on what you think is the best government investment in the last, let's say, 10, 20 years.
Wow.
To put you on the spot.
I'm sure there have been. California's made a lot of progress on climate change issues. This state met its 2020 goals, which were, when we passed them in 2006, it wasn't clear that was going to happen, and so I think that was a big success story. And the ambition of the state's whole climate goals is, there's a lot more to do. I mean, the electrification of the car transportation system is enormous. So, I think for California, even a state as blue as this, to pull together the magnitude of change that has to happen to reach those kind of goals is a pretty big deal. I think we've overhauled the prison system in a big way, that actually, now crime is ticking up. So I think that's obviously going to be a big issue in this election year, and what happens to those policies going forward is a question. But we had a giant prison system that had, I think, 180,000 population in prisons at its peak, and we were under a court order to reduce the prison population, and it got kicked. The can got kicked down the road for many years, and then finally Jerry Brown passed a realignment that shrunk the population down to, I think, about 130,000, and then and since then it's gone down to more like 100,000. And Newsom has talked about closing 2, or he recently mentioned maybe 3 prisons. So I think the idea that we are over incarcerating and that we need to treat some of these offenses in different ways, to this point, it has been a success story. I think, obviously crime is going to be an issue this year, and what that does to these policies, I don't know. But, I was thinking of our education system. It's, there's still a lot more work to do. And, the local control funding formula was a big deal. We totally changed just about 6 years ago how schools are funded, what every school gets, and with an eye towards closing the achievement gap. That was a huge change, but we still are a long way from closing the achievement gap. So getting that policy through was a big deal. I think
yeah, I mean, I think the criminal justice issue that Dave just mentioned, I think just points to how challenging it is to answer that question as sort of nonprofit, nonpartisan journalists. Because of course, if you look at realignment or Prop 47 and Prop 57, all these touted criminal justice reform measures, those are either great civil rights victories in California or the reason that crime is ticking up now. And so it's depending on who you ask.
Yeah.
I will say, I guess, I tend to focus on elections, and the changes that California has introduced to the way that people vote. The fact that during the pandemic, everyone got a ballot in the mail. That was, for better or for worse, a huge change to the way that we vote, and I think that's been pretty.
Yeah, there's been a number of voting reforms. I mean, you hear about all the reforms that are rolling back access around the country. California passed same-day voter registration, passed internet registration, and then now mailing ballots out to voters. So I mean, but our turnout, frankly, still is not that high nationally. We're still below average nationally in voter turnout, despite that. In fact, we had our record low turnout ever in history in 2014. It was 31%, which is pretty hard to believe.
What's the expectation for this primary? I mean, it's terrible, right?
I haven't heard any. It's a good question. I mean, I don't know what's going to draw people to the polls. I don't.
It will be an interesting sort of test case, though, because again, everyone who's registered is getting a ballot, and so does that counteract some of the all the sort of fundamental factors would suggest that it's going to be low, just because it is a primary during sort of an off season and a year where there's a Democrat in the White House, and so a lot of Democrats won't be as enthusiastic to turn out, and that in California that generally means the fewer people turn out.
Yeah,
so we'll see.
And we have a U.S. senator and the governor on the ballot, but there's no race there really. I mean, which is pretty astounding to me. They have an open seat for U.S. Senate, and I don't think most people even know there's an election.
Did you say that 45% of the surplus is spent on education?
I want to say, yeah. So under sort of a constitutional requirement, a certain percentage, is it 45?
It's about 45. Yeah, Prop 98.
Okay, so that seems like that's a lot of money. Do you have any idea what specifically that will be spent on to, as you said, decrease that achievement gap?
So it goes in the budget. One of the things when we overhauled the budget, there's just a base amount that goes to every school. And then there's an incremental amount on top of that for how many English learner students you have, and an amount for every student who gets free or reduced price lunches. And then there's another, if you have a concentration of more than 50% of those two categories, then you get another bump. But that's the budget. That's how it's distributed. There used to be all kinds of categoricals that were all eliminated. There were like, I think 30 or 40 different buckets the schools got their budget in, and now it was simplified. So it's distributed that way. And, I mean, honestly, there's not a lot of, not only is there not a lot of state control on how it's spent, but there's not a lot of, reporting on how it's spent either. There's been a big fight in the legislature the last couple of years for school districts to tell the state how it spent that LCFF money, those incremental amounts that were supposed to close the achievement gap. And, it hasn't passed. So there's no reporting requirement to the state about how they spend that money. We're doing a story right now about, how schools spent their stimulus money, because they got several $1 billion they didn't expect. And, it's very hard to see what they did. So the total school budget now is going to be $128 billion, which is $22,000 per student, which is way higher than it's ever been here. I still haven't seen how that ranks us nationally. We were actually one of the lowest in the country. We were down below 45th, I believe, for a long time, and in per pupil spending. Now, not only is the budget going up, but enrollment is dropping. So our per pupil spending is way up, but I have not seen the national rank yet. That data kind of lags.
As you look towards the future in the next few years, do you see any potential for change in the opposite direction, given that we had pretty good times, as you mentioned, over the last year, but this year there's a lot of that in question. There's a lot of companies and people who've kind of publicly been leaving because of their, unhappiness maybe with some of the things going on. What do you see for the future?
Yeah, the Legislative Analyst's Office just did a real quick turnaround analysis of the governor's May revise the week before last, and they did this chart of the likelihood of a recession, and they had 5 indicators that are all definitely there's about to be a recession, and it was raising questions actually about the budget estimate, the revenue estimates that are built into the budget. Are they really going to happen? But so, and then the other thing is that the California budget is good news, bad news. It is extremely volatile. I think, like Ben mentioned, 80% of the budget comes from the income tax, and half of that is from the 1%, the top 1% of earners in California. So, it really, it goes with Wall Street. And I think there's no question. When it drops, it's going to drop a lot. And I think, frankly, that's why we're not talking about a tax cut, even though we've got $100 billion surplus. I think because there's an anticipation that it's going to drop. And like I said, the LAO has estimated what the impact of a recession would be. And it's, I know if I remember this right, it's about $70 billion over 2 years in revenue loss. And so a lot of, it's not long before you cut into school spending and things like that. So I don't have any crystal ball, but I think you can see the LAO is paid to be careful, and I think they're telling the state to prepare for something in the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, their big takeaway from that report was, the state is now parking an additional $30 billion into reserves, that's not enough according to them, because we need to prepare.
Any more questions?
Can you talk more about how the state budget and or initiatives gets distributed to local governments? Does it just vary based on initiative, or is there a standard on how it gets distributed from a population perspective? And I'll say part of the reason why I'm asking that is like what's important to us in San Francisco may be different than Central Valley or elsewhere. So I'm just wondering like how that actually plays out in the political process.
So county government is mostly funded by the state. City government is mostly funded by the city. So and counties mostly do parks and rec and welfare programs and a lot of transportation. So those are all buckets that have their own formulas. And, I think obviously the welfare programs are all by number of applications and things like that. But when it comes to, police and fire and all the municipal costs, those are not the state.
Although the state will, through legislation, provide additional, programmatically additional support, but it's sort of a one-off or sort of a case-by-case basis.
So Dave, by not the state, you mean property taxes primarily? Is it
Property taxes are a big
and-
part, yeah. And sales taxes. Yeah.
So what is not being funded? What's a glaring hole that's not being addressed with the state budget?
Frank, we have a backlog on our roads. There's a huge backlog on repairs for roads. I know that's still outstanding. There's I think I said the governor put $35 billion into climate programs, and the environmentalists wanted closer to 75. So there's a feeling, and there's that ballot measure to pay for part of that to try and raise more money for climate to achieve the climate goals. Let's see what's not funded. There's a lot.
I know a lot of cities, municipal governments were sort of disappointed by the amount that's going towards housing for the homeless.
Yeah, and also there's disappointment in the amount of money going to higher education. Feeling that should be more.
I guess that's maybe just the optics or a political challenge to all of this is once you announce that you have $100 billion in surplus, it's all of a sudden everyone says, well, wait, why are you only giving me $10 billion? You have $100 billion.
Sorry, it's more of a comment because I'd love to add on to that. One thing that isn't being funded that took a big hit in the last recession is Medi-Cal reimbursement rates. So it's incredibly expensive, and places like Planned Parenthood or other federally qualified health centers aren't being reimbursed for the actual cost of care. And they have to scrounge around and find ways to fill the gap. And that is something that consistently does not get funded and hasn't been returned to that level since the recession. That's one that I can think of.
So that's interesting.
And I remember that one. And I was going to say affordable housing too is like the biggest issue in the state, but it's actually too big for the state to even pay for. It's really it's tens of billions of dollars a year. But that's probably the biggest unfunded. We have to build a lot of housing.
So who's going to do that?
Well,
The market is going to come to battery.
You somehow got to incentivize private money to do it. The state can seed it, but the amount of construction that has to be done is beyond what the state can pay for.
Well, I always know we have a good session when we get questions that actually stump our journalists, which is good. And you win the prize. Congratulations. I really appreciate you all being here. You know, Dave mentioned a lot of these candidates have been in for interviews. We have our voter guide, which is, if you go to calmatters.org, our website, the voter guide there is a guide to all the elections that we're covering, all the interviews with those candidates, some great videos contrasting their positions, graphics showing their positions, live campaign finance data, so you can find out who's paying for all these candidates. And that's the one, every 2 years, the voter guide is sort of the thing that most connects us with people, right? People, they do a Google search about why am I voting on kidney dialysis again? And they find CalMatters, they come to us. One of the main ways that people discover us. So please take a look at that. If you don't get our daily newsletter, What Matters, please do. It's a great quick read of everything going on in the state that you need to know about, links to our stories and other people's stories. And a really chintzy answer to what's not being funded: nonprofit journalism is not being funded, right? We are nonprofit. We raise funds from the people who care about the stories we cover and want to see more coverage of this. We are doing this to fill the gap, right? Dave and I used to work for major metropolitan daily newspapers that are much smaller than they used to be and getting smaller every day. Believe it or not, San Francisco is lucky to have the Chronicle. As much as you might question how it compares to the way it used to look 10, 20, 30 years ago, it's one of the few remaining robust publications left in the state. So we're trying to cover things in Sacramento. We're trying to cover things across the state. We do rely on donations. We'd love to have your support. My colleague Priyanka's here with us as well. We'd love to talk to you more about that or answer any other questions you have about us and what we do cover and what we don't cover, as you learned a little bit about tonight. So thank you all for coming. And Dave and Ben, thank you.
Thank you.